a landlord, eager to raise rents and push out longtime tenants, evicts a black family without a second thought, believing they're just another obstacle in his way. But what he doesn't know is that this family's eviction will set off a chain of events that will turn his world upside down in ways he never saw coming. Stick around, because this story of resilience, justice, and an unforgettable twist will leave you speechless. And trust me, you won't want to miss how the tables are turned on this landlord. If you're into stories that expose injustice and celebrate strength, make sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a powerful story like this one. Let's dive in. The Henderson family had lived in their small, cozy apartment in the heart of Greenpoint for nearly a decade. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it had a warmth that made it feel like home. Friends gathered for barbecues, kids played in the nearby park, and neighbors looked out for each other. For Patrice Henderson, a middle school teacher, and her husband, Daniel, a mechanic, it was an affordable and supportive community to raise their children, Maya and Elijah. But over the past year, things had started to change. New businesses were opening up, rent prices were rising, and the neighborhood was slowly becoming a target for developers eager to turn Greenpoint into an upmarket area. Patrice and Daniel could feel the subtle shift, but they held on to hope that they'd be able to stay in their home. Then one evening, a notice appeared on their door, a 30-day eviction notice. Patrice's heart sank as she read the words, her hands shaking. "But we've never missed a rent payment," Daniel said, his voice filled with anger and disbelief. "How can they just throw us out?" When Patrice tried to contact the landlord, Mr. Grayson, he wouldn't return her calls. He didn't reply to her emails or answer the door when she went to his office. Eventually, she found out through a mutual acquaintance that Mr. Grayson had a history of using shady tactics to drive out long-term tenants, particularly families of color, so he could bring in wealthier residents willing to pay higher rent. Feeling heartbroken and helpless, Patrice and Daniel had no choice but to start packing up their lives. But little did Mr. Grayson know, this eviction would set off a chain of events that would ultimately backfire in ways he could never have anticipated. The Hendersons spent the next few weeks packing up their belongings, each item a reminder of the life they had built in that apartment. Maya and Elijah were devastated, unable to understand why they had to leave the only home they had ever known. Maya, just 10 years old, clutched her favorite doll as she looked around the emptying apartment. "Why do we have to go, Mom?" she asked, her voice trembling. Patrice hugged her daughter tightly. "Sometimes people make unfair decisions, baby, but we're going to find a new home, and we'll be together. That's what matters." Meanwhile, Daniel worked tirelessly to keep up his kids' spirits. He told them stories about all the fun they'd have at the new place, even though he didn't yet know where that would be. Inside, he was struggling with anger and frustration, unable to shake the feeling that they were being forced out because of who they were. On the day they left, Patrice took one last look at the apartment, the memories of birthday parties, family dinners, and late-night talks flooding her mind. She felt a mix of sadness and determination. She knew they'd find a way to rebuild, but she couldn't shake the injustice of the situation. Just as they were loading the last few boxes into their car, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up outside the building. Mr. Grayson stepped out, adjusting his expensive coat, and barely glanced in their direction. He smirked, satisfied that the problem tenants were finally leaving. But Patrice met his gaze with a calm, unyielding stare, as if silently telling him that his victory was temporary. After moving into a small rental on the other side of town, the Hendersons settled into their new life. But Patrice and Daniel couldn't let go of what had happened. Patrice confided in her friend Angela, a fellow teacher and a longtime resident of the community. Angela, who had witnessed the rise of gentrification and displacement in Greenpoint, was outraged by the Hendersons' story. "You know, this isn't the first time Mr. Grayson has done this," Angela said, her eyes flashing with anger. He's been targeting families and low-income tenants for years. He's getting rich by pushing people out of their homes. Angela suggested that Patrice speak to her cousin, Derek, a prominent civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on cases of housing discrimination. Patrice had never thought of taking legal action, but the more she learned about Mr. Grayson's history, the more determined she became to fight back. Derek met with Patrice and Daniel the next week, listening intently as they recounted their story. What Grayson is doing is not only unethical, but likely illegal, Derek said firmly. If he's targeting Black families or lower-income tenants specifically, we have grounds for a serious case against him. With Derek's guidance, the Hendersons filed a formal complaint against Mr. Grayson, citing discrimination and unlawful eviction practices. News of the case quickly spread through the community, and soon, other tenants who had faced similar treatment came forward with their own stories of being forced out by Grayson. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a systematic effort to drive out families who didn't fit his vision for Greenpoint. As the legal proceedings began, Grayson remained dismissive, confident that his wealth and power would protect him, but he had no idea that the Hendersons weren't going down without a fight, or that they had allies in high places. While the lawsuit was underway, Mr. Grayson continued with his plans to renovate and re-rent the Hendersons' old apartment. He very staples it as a luxury loft in an up-and-coming neighborhood, hoping to attract affluent tenants. A few weeks later, a couple reached out, expressing interest in renting the apartment. They were from out of town and willing to pay the increased rent without negotiation, which suited Grayson fine. When they arrived to finalize the lease, Grayson greeted them warmly, eager to impress. The couple was well-dressed and polite, though they had an air of confidence that put Grayson slightly on edge. They introduced themselves as Jackson and Camille Turner, and after a brief tour of the apartment, they signed the lease without hesitation. Unbeknownst to Grayson, the Turners were more than just wealthy professionals. They were renowned advocates for housing justice and longtime friends of Derek, the Hendersons' attorney. In fact, they had rented the apartment specifically to support the Hendersons' case and to expose Grayson's discriminatory practices. As the weeks went by, Grayson remained oblivious to the Turners' true motives. He was just pleased to have desirable tenants who paid on time and took care of the property. But what he didn't know was that the Turners were carefully documenting every interaction with him, gathering evidence to support the case against him. Meanwhile, the lawsuit against Grayson was making waves. News outlets began covering the story, bringing attention to the broader issue of gentrification and housing discrimination in the city. People who had experienced similar injustices started sharing their stories on social media, creating a groundswell of public support for the Hendersons and other displaced families. In the midst of the media attention, the Turners quietly conducted their own investigation. They interviewed former tenants, gathered testimonies from families who had been evicted by Grayson, and connected with activists working to combat housing discrimination. Their goal was to create an airtight case that would expose Grayson's tactics and force him to answer for his actions. One afternoon, Camille invited Grayson over to discuss some concerns they had about the apartment. Grayson arrived, eager to maintain a good relationship with his high-value tenants. But when he walked in, he was greeted not by complaints, but by a team of reporters who had been invited to witness the confrontation. "Mr. Grayson," Jackson said, his tone calm but firm, "we'd like to discuss your pattern of discriminatory eviction practices." Grayson's face turned pale as he realized what was happening. He stammered, trying to come up with a response, but Jackson continued, listing the countless families, including the Hendersons, who had been unjustly forced out of their homes under his watch. The reporters took notes, cameras flashing as they captured Grayson's stunned expression. "These families deserve justice," Camille added, "and we're here to make sure they get it." Grayson left the apartment in a rage, Realizing that his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble, the Turners had exposed him, and the story quickly went viral. Within hours, Grayson's name was all over the news, his reputation tarnished by the revelations of his discriminatory practices. The Turners' public confrontation with Grayson became a turning point in the Hendersons' case. With the added media pressure and the wealth of evidence that the Turners and Derek had gathered, Grayson's legal team began to waver. In a last-ditch effort to avoid further damage, Grayson offered a settlement to the Hendersons, hoping they would accept and end the lawsuit quietly. But Patrice and Daniel, with Derek's guidance, refused to settle. They wanted Grayson to be held accountable in court, not just for their sake, but for every family he had wronged. The trial attracted widespread attention, with community members, activists, and former tenants packing the courtroom to show their support for the Hendersons. As the evidence was presented, emails, testimonies, and documentation of Grayson's targeted evictions, it became clear that his actions weren't just unethical, they were illegal. When the jury returned with a verdict, it was a resounding victory for the Hendersons. Grayson was found guilty of housing discrimination, and he was ordered to pay substantial damages not only to the Hendersons, but also to a fund supporting fair housing initiatives across the city. The court also ruled that Grayson had to implement anti-discrimination policies across all his properties, under the watchful eye of a housing rights watchdog organization. It was a landmark decision that set a precedent for housing justice, and it sent a powerful message to other landlords who exploited vulnerable tenants. After the verdict, the Hendersons were overwhelmed by the support from their community and from people across the country who had been following their story. They felt vindicated, not just for themselves, but for every family who had suffered at the hands of landlords like Grayson. They had turned their pain into a victory, one that would protect others from the same injustice. But the story didn't end there. With the compensation they received from the case, Patrice and Daniel were able to put a down payment on a new home in a neighborhood that welcomed them with open arms. For the first time in years, they had the stability and security they had longed for. The experience had strengthened their family's bond and taught Maya and Elijah powerful lessons about resilience and standing up for what's right. Yet, Patrice couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she could do. The eviction had ignited a fire in her, a desire to continue fighting for housing justice, not just for her family, but for all families affected by gentrification and discriminatory practices. She reached out to Derek, the attorney who had helped her through the case, and shared her vision to create an organization dedicated to empowering tenants, educating them on their rights, and advocating for fair housing policies. Derek, thrilled by the idea, agreed to partner with her. Together, they founded Home for All, a nonprofit organization that provided free legal support, financial counseling, and resources for tenants facing eviction or discrimination. With the funds from their case and donations that poured in from supporters, they set up offices in Greenpoint and surrounding areas, quickly becoming a lifeline for families in need. Under Patrice's leadership, Home for All gained momentum. They hosted workshops on tenants' rights, provided free legal clinics, and advocated for policies that protected low-income families and communities of color from predatory practices. Word spread quickly, and families across the city began reaching out for help, grateful for the support and resources they hadn't previously known were available. Patrice was relentless. She spoke at city council meetings, joined coalitions with other housing advocates, and even met with local lawmakers to push for stronger protections for renters. She became a voice for the voiceless, a champion for those who had been pushed aside by a system that prioritized profits over people. Her story inspired others to come forward. Former tenants of Grayson's properties shared their experiences, contributing to a wave of testimonies that underscored the need for lasting change. Thanks to her organization's advocacy, new legislation, was passed in the city council that imposed penalties on landlords who violated housing discrimination laws, protected tenants from unjust evictions, and offered incentives for landlords to keep rent affordable. While Patrice and her organization thrived, Grayson's fortunes took a sharp decline. The court's ruling had placed his properties under strict monitoring, and with his discriminatory practices exposed, many of his wealthier tenants began to move out, uncomfortable with being associated with a scandal. As news of Grayson's actions continued to circulate, he found it harder to maintain his properties, and his reputation within the real estate community plummeted. No longer seen as a desirable landlord, he struggled to find tenants willing to pay his high rents. Grayson was eventually forced to sell several of his buildings, and as his wealth dwindled, he watched helplessly as the empire he had built on the backs of exploited tenants crumbled. Meanwhile, the properties he sold were purchased by a coalition of housing nonprofits, with Home for All among the lead partners. They turned these buildings into affordable housing units, ensuring that the apartments would be accessible to families who had been pushed out by gentrification and rising rents. It was a poetic turn of events. The very properties Grayson had once used to profit off others' suffering were now dedicated to providing stability and dignity to those in need. Years passed, and Patrice's impact continued to grow. Home for All expanded to multiple cities, providing resources and advocacy for tenants nationwide. The organization became a model for housing justice, inspiring other communities to set up similar initiatives and fight back against housing discrimination. Patrice's tireless work earned her recognition far and wide. She received awards for her advocacy, was invited to speak at national conferences, and became a symbol of resilience and justice. Through it all, she remained grounded, remembering the moment her family had been unjustly evicted and the pain it had caused. She channeled that pain into her work, determined to make a difference for every family facing similar struggles. In her new home, Patrice and her family found peace and security. Maya and Elijah grew up learning the importance of standing up for what's right, and they watched with pride as their mother became a respected leader in the fight for housing justice. Patrice's journey had come full circle, from a mother forced out of her home to a community leader who had changed the lives of countless others. One sunny afternoon, years after the eviction, Patrice sat on her porch, watching as Maya and Elijah played in the yard. The neighborhood was filled with families from all walks of life, a true reflection of the diversity and warmth that Patrice had always loved. As she looked around, she felt a sense of fulfillment and gratitude. The hardship they had endured was no longer a wound, but a source of strength. Just then, her phone rang. It was Angela, her old friend who had introduced her to Derek years ago. "Did you hear about Grayson?" Angela asked. Patrice raised an eyebrow. "No, what happened?" "He filed for bankruptcy," Angela replied. "Lost nearly everything. I guess karma caught up with him." Patrice sighed, a bittersweet smile on her face. "I don't take joy in anyone's downfall, Angela, but I hope he's learned something from all of this." They talked for a while longer, reminiscing about the journey that had brought Patrice to where she was. When she hung up, Patrice felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought for justice, not revenge, and in doing so she had transformed her pain into a force for good. As she sat back and watched her children play, Patrice knew that she had created a legacy, not just for her family, but for the entire community. Through her strength and resilience, she had turned the tables, leaving a lasting impact that would protect generations to come. The Henderson family's story became a reminder to everyone that no matter how powerful the forces against you, standing up for what is right can create change that echoes far beyond your own life. Patrice had not only reclaimed her family's dignity, she had paved the way for a more just and compassionate future. And that was the ultimate victory. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more exciting content. Share this video with your friends